And by the way, this quote is from the GMAT, the people who make the test. So if we use the old mantra, knowledge is power, then it's almost like trying to learn how to swim by reading a book about swimming. Swimming is a skill. It's not just the knowledge. So when you think about preparing for the GMAT, you could think of this as a test of some sort of a maybe physical skill, maybe like a sport. And if you want to participate in the Olympics, it's not enough just to read a book about swimming. We really need to take the time to develop these skills. And again, I'm going to show you the strategies of how you can do that, how you can actually step by step develop pretty much any skill you would like. And certainly, because we're here to prepare for the GMAT, how do you develop the skill to ace and succeed on the GMAT? Now, that skill to succeed on the GMAT is going to involve a combination of a few skills. Right? It's knowing the foundations. Yes, that is important. You do need to know what's a prime number. You do need to know what's the difference between a fact and opinion. It will also involve specific strategies for different types of questions. Like, how do you answer these types of questions? If I see X, I'm going to do Y. So that is going to be a huge part of your preparation. And of course, getting mentally ready for the test. This is a challenging test. It's very time sensitive. You have a lot of time pressure. You have just 2 minutes per question. So you need to be working fast. And again, the questions get harder and harder. So it's a very humbling test. But again, if you are ready, then this is your opportunity to shine and show everyone, including, of course, most importantly, the admissions committees at the business schools, that you are ready for the competitive business school, for the rigor of that MBA program. You are a strong candidate. So speaking about specific strategies for different types of questions, let's talk about specific strategies for critical reasoning. There are quite a few different types of questions in critical reasoning, and today during a 2-hour class, we won't be able, of course, to cover all of them. We also need to build some of the foundations. Like, for example, in our 6-week program, we spend over an hour talking about how do I identify different types of assumptions and what are different patterns you can look for in the argument in order for you to be able to see what the author said and what the author didn't say, and so on. So there's quite a lot of different strategies that involve breaking down these questions and identifying different types of questions. But I want to show you a sample of some of these strategies. And these are all real strategies that really work. And we can begin talking about these strategies by talking about the basic structure, the basic components of the argument. So what are the basic components of the arguments? First of all, what is an argument, ladies and gentlemen? Have you ever seen people argue? What do you think? How does an argument usually look like? Like when you see somebody argues, what does that mean? What does it look like? Let me know in the chat box. Does somebody say disagreement? Okay. Using facts. Okay. Express their opinions. Okay. Passionate debate. Okay. Express their point of view. Okay, somebody has a point and the other person disagrees with it or refutes it, take a stand. Okay, yeah, so when we talk about an argument, we usually imagine two people, they're trying to argue about something. Sometimes people argue and they don't even know what they're arguing about. That's quite pathetic. Right, I'm sure we've all been there. So sometimes it's like, what's your point, right? Sometimes we ask people, they just, they argue and argue and argue and like, what's your point, right? Somebody's saying exchange of opposite views. So sometimes we think, okay, so I have an opposite view and I'm going to try to convince someone, right? Okay, so these are all, again, different perceptions of what the arguments are, and the word argument could potentially mean different things for different people. But let's talk about what it actually means on the GMAT. On the GMAT, an argument is a point supported by evidence. So every argument must have a point. Let's call it this point a conclusion or a claim, because this is what the GMAT calls them as well. But they can also call them a main point or a main idea of an argument. Sometimes they also call them hypotheses of an argument. Okay? So let me give you a very simple argument. I'm taking the Admit Master GMAT Mastery program, therefore I will get a high score on the GMAT. Well, what's my opinion? My opinion here, my point is I will get a high score on the GMAT. Why do I believe that? It's not enough for me to just say I'll get a high score on the GMAT. Just like it's not enough for Sasha to say we should all eat meat. Why? I want to know why. In order for this to become an argument, I need the why. And that why is the evidence, also known as the premise. Now, premise is a technical term for evidence, and you do need to know that term because the GMAT does use it. Essentially, it's the reason behind that point or the reason behind that idea. So what was the reason why I believed I was going to get a high score on the GMAT? Well, as long as I give you at least one reason, that becomes an argument. And that reason is I'm taking the Admit Master GMAT Mastery program. Now, can I make this a better argument? Yes, absolutely. I can do that by adding more evidence. And the more relevant evidence that I add that supports the conclusion, the stronger going to be an argument. So I could say, for example, I have a lot of friends who've taken the Admit Master GMAT Mastery program and they all did really well. Or, I met the professor and I like the color of his shirt. Whatever. So in any case, usually in these arguments, there's still a bit of a leap of faith. So the majority of the arguments are not fully logical. The only way to make this argument fully logical would be to say, everybody who takes the Admit Master GMAT Mastery program gets a high score on the GMAT. And if that is the case, that becomes a fully logical argument. So the majority of the arguments could be strengthened by adding more evidence. But rarely on the GMAT you are going to meet a fully logical argument, sometimes also known as the syllogism. One of the examples of a fully logical argument. So let's have a look at a question that's actually going to give us an argument and is going to ask us to support that argument. In fact, I'd like to ask you to work on this question. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, maybe just slightly more. Feel free to read this question, read the answer choices if you'd like, and try to come up with what you believe is the correct answer to this question. Just please don't Google it. It kind of defeats the purpose. I'm going to again launch the poll, and when I see that most of you have responded, we're going to talk about it. But I'll give you maybe 2.5 minutes at most to work on this question. One more minute to go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me go ahead and end the poll and share the results with you, and we could see what we have voted for. So it looks like B is the correct answer. Well, at least that's the answer that was chosen by half of everybody who voted here in this meeting, followed by C and then by D. Well, let's see if B is actually the correct answer. Let's have a look at a few different ways of doing this question. And perhaps I could try to read your mind a little bit here and understand what you may have done. Feel free to give me thumbs up in the chat box if that is what you've done. By the way, nobody else sees your chat messages except for me. So I'm not going to share your name if you've done one of these things or the other. And I've been teaching the GMAT for 15 years, and trust me, I have seen everything. So one of the ways to do this question is to do what seems right. A lot of the people approach the verbal section as what makes the most logical sense. So here's what they're going to do is they'll read the passage, read the question, read the answer choices, and just try to go by what makes the most sense. This question was about excavation. It was about earthquakes. They hypothesized that the destruction was due to the earthquake, and we asked to support it. So we're going to be looking for something that basically tells us, yeah, it was probably that earthquake. Let's have a look through the answer choices. A talks about bronze ceremonial drinking vessels. What does this have to do with the earthquake? Well, B talks about the earthquake. And it talks about Cyprus, it talks about AD 365, which is exactly what we need. So it seems pretty good so far. C talks about coins. You know, coins after 365. Okay, so again, what does coins have to do with it? Similarly with small statues and stone inscriptions. So sounds a little weird why they're bringing in these artifacts. We are talking about excavation and we are talking about the earthquake. So what a lot of people will do is they'll say, okay, well, I guess I missed something important from this passage. Let me go back and try to reread this passage and make sure that I don't really pull anything new from it. Maybe I haven't missed anything and go back through the answer choices again. And then eventually most people are going to pick B. And if they have more time, they would usually keep going back and reading. And then at some point, they're going to say, you know what? Okay, time for me to move on. Let's look at maybe a different way of doing this question. And we'll also figure out whether B is the correct answer. And I've noticed some of you are saying that that's exactly what you've done. And that's totally fine. Totally fine. We all start in somewhere and we all have a certain way of tackling different kinds of problems, different kinds of questions. And that's why I always suggest take a practice test first before you begin studying, just to see kind of where you stand in terms of the things you do naturally, how close they are to what you need to actually get a good score on the GMAT. Some people are just kind of naturally ready for the test. I don't want to say naturally smart. It's not about being smart. It's they may have learned these kinds of skills before, and that's why you hear of some people taking a practice test and score pretty well already, and then just a couple weeks and they go for the real test. I was one of them. But if we haven't learned these strategies, then we might need to actually do that. So yeah, and somebody is saying, I don't think that's the right answer. We're going to find out in a moment. And also, it's a little bit tricky because the GMAT is asking us which one most strongly supports the hypothesis, right? So that means like maybe a better answer. Yeah, maybe. Somebody's also saying the question couldn't be that easy. Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Like, what makes the question easy, right? What makes it easy is a lot of people get it right. What makes it hard, a lot of people get it wrong. But for us, sometimes if we're comfortable with certain concepts, we could deal with a hard question easily, and we can get stuck on the easy question. That's why, again, preparing for the test is a little bit about knowing yourself, knowing what you might need to work on, and really honestly, sometimes making sure that you are covering everything, covering all the bases, because you don't know exactly what the GMAT is going to show you on the test day. So the more that you can cover and the more strategies that you can learn, the more you're setting yourself up for success. So let's look at maybe a little bit of a different way of looking at this question. And again, we're going to get to what is actually the correct answer here. So one of the ways of doing this question, this is where many people are going to progress when they realize that they need to learn something new, is they start by learning the rules. They're saying, okay, so there are certain rules, there are certain things that I can do, there are certain steps that I can take. And they read sometimes, different books and look for that advice, pick out that advice. So see, with some of these, intellectually, we can understand what this advice is saying. For example, one of the advices is read the question first, not the passage. Right? So if we learn that rule, then we could save potentially a lot of time because we could be a lot more focused when we are doing critical reasoning questions. So let's actually do that. Let's read the question. The question is, which one of the following, if true, most strongly supports the archaeologist's hypothesis? We're being asked to support the hypothesis. So that means that we need to find something that will strengthen that hypothesis that was in the passage. Okay, so what was that hypothesis? Well, let's look at the passage. Let's identify what was that hypothesis and what was the evidence on which this hypothesis was based. And our objective will be to strengthen the hypothesis, which is basically the conclusion, not something else. Right? There are a few things that they've mentioned here, but what is it we're going to strengthen? Well, we need to strengthen the actual conclusion, the opinion. Just like if you remember when we talked about Sasha and Jamal, one of the answer choices was saying, refuting her statement about prehistoric ancestors. Well, that was the evidence. Jamal wasn't refuting her evidence. He was trying to disagree with her opinion. So that's very different. That's why it's very important for us to identify the conclusion. Okay, so what's the conclusion here? The conclusion was that the hypothesis was the destruction was due to this major earthquake known to have occurred near the island in AD 365. Okay, so we're going to be looking for something that tells us that this is more likely to be correct, that the hypothesis is supported by additional data. And that excavation and collapsed buildings, we're not going to try to support that because that's our evidence. Okay, so let's have a look at what supports what. A, bronze ceremonial drinking vessels. Does it support the hypothesis destruction was due to this earthquake? Doesn't seem like that. Doesn't seem like it supports the opinion or conclusion. Doesn't even seem like it supports the evidence. So it's not really very relevant. That's what it seems like. B, most modern history is mentioned. So they are adding some new evidence, new information that tells us that yes, it's actually very likely that the earthquake occurred near the island in AD 365. We have a lot more evidence to that. Well, they've been hypothesizing this, and it seems like there's more evidence that would basically seem to support their conclusion. So B seems to strengthen it. Now they're also asking us which one most strongly supports. So maybe there's something that strengthens it even more. So then we can continue going to answer choice C that talks about the coins. Again, does it support somehow their hypothesis that there was this earthquake that destroyed the town? Doesn't seem like it. And similarly with D and E, it doesn't seem like it's doing anything really to our conclusion. I mean, we need something about the earthquake, right? So B seems the right answer. So even if we break things down and understand what the conclusion is and learn a little bit about the kind of the basic structure, and we understand it again, maybe intellectually, we understand, okay, so here are the different components, and maybe even take the time to break down the argument into these components and follow the steps, the kind of more efficient steps of doing the question by reading the question first, we could still get into trouble because B is not the correct answer. So what is the right answer? Well, let's talk about a different approach. Let's maybe go one step further. Yes, it is important for us to intellectually understand the different components and the steps, but we also need to be able to analyze. We need to be able to apply our skills. So let's call this next way the master of the skill way. Now, there's still some steps that we're going to take. And still, the first step, a good first step to take, would be to read the question first. It is a strengthened question. So we are asked to support the hypothesis. Now, we are also going to read the passage and break it down into the conclusion and the evidence. But when we're doing this, here's what we need to ask ourselves. What is the evidence which means I know that it's true 100%? It's a fact. And what is the conclusion or opinion which I don't yet know whether it is true? We are asked to support that opinion. So what is it that we know that is true? Well, what we know is true, what's a fact or evidence that's given to us in this argument, is that there was a pattern of debris in collapsed buildings. That was evidence. It points to a suggestion, or it says that this is typical of towns devastated by earthquakes. This was evidence, right? So we know that the town was likely destroyed by an earthquake. There's evidence that points to that. It was likely destroyed by an earthquake. That is what we know. What else do we know? Well, in the last sentence, we see they have hypothesized that the destruction was due to a major earthquake known to have occurred near the island in AD 365. That means that they knew that there was an earthquake in AD 365. That is also a fact. 100% true. So the question is, what is that we don't know? What do they need to believe in order to claim that the town was destroyed by that earthquake? Well, if we know the town was destroyed by an earthquake, because there's a pattern of debris in collapsed buildings, and we know there was an earthquake in AD 365, what else could have happened other than the town be destroyed by that earthquake? Is it possible that the town may have been destroyed by some other earthquake? Yes, it's entirely possible. So we're basically learning how to answer the right questions. And there's strategies for everything, like how to identify what questions to ask. Asking the right questions is actually a very important skill, right? When we teach our 6-week GMAT mastery program, this is usually where we start. Is knowing and being aware that asking the right questions will help you uncover what's actually hidden here in this argument. So what we don't know essentially is which earthquake destroyed the town. If it's that earthquake, then we can draw a conclusion that would be their hypothesis. But if it's some other earthquake, then we can't really draw that conclusion. So what we're going to need is to support that assumption, which is something we believe, on which this hypothesis is based. And that is that it must have been that earthquake, not some other earthquake. So that's what we're going to try to support. We need to find some new facts that will tell us that it's likely that it was that earthquake, or it was unlikely that it was some other earthquake that destroyed this town. Let's now have a look at the answer choices. Now we know what we're looking for, so we can be a lot more efficient. A, bronze ceremonial drinking vessels before and after 365 were found there. Well, does that help us understand whether it was that earthquake or some other earthquake? Not really. It was before and after, so not a lot has changed. How about B? Well, B says most modern histories mention there was an earthquake. Wait a second. Isn't that something we knew already? An argument already told us that the earthquake is known to have occurred near the island in AD 365. So we already knew that. Telling us again that there was an earthquake in 365 does not make this argument any better. Doesn't make it any worse either. But it does not strengthen it. And this is the point where many people are going to argue and say, but wait a second. But it also seems to strengthen it. So can't we maybe disagree on which answer choice strengthens it more? I feel like it strengthens it, because if we have a lot of additional evidence that there was actually an earthquake in 365, wouldn't that mean that there's more reason for us to believe them, these archaeologists? Well, see, in real life, sometimes we can strengthen the argument by providing more evidence about something we already know. Some facts, right? So somebody else will come and say, yes, you're actually right, these facts are correct. But on the GMAT, that's not how we analyze the arguments. On the GMAT, facts are facts. They are 100% true. The only thing that is going to support or strengthen the argument is going to be a new fact that would make the argument more likely to be true, or the conclusion more likely to be true. And ultimately, the way that we're doing this is we're trying to strengthen the assumption in the argument. So now that we found an assumption, and the assumption was it was that earthquake, not some other one, let's keep going, because that's what we need to strengthen. So B, as tempting as it is, it actually does not strengthen it at all. It just keeps it the same. Because we knew that there was an earthquake, you cannot make anything that's already 100% true even more true. So let's look at answer choice C. It says no coins minted after 365 were found in Korean, but coins minted before that year were found in abundance. So what does that actually mean? Well, that means that something happened in 365, something significant. If we are able to find a lot of coins before 365 and all of a sudden no coins after, and something must have happened. Maybe an earthquake. So this certainly suggests that there was something big that happened in 365. Combined with all of the information that we've had already, that will actually strengthen the argument, because it makes it more likely there was that earthquake that destroyed the town, because we found new evidence that tells us that the town was likely destroyed in 365. And we can actually do this in less than a minute if we know what we are looking for and if we do the proper analysis. So breaking down the structure of an argument, looking for the conclusion, the evidence, how they're related to each other is going to be very important. And again, it's a skill. Everything you need to know about that subject matter is going to be in the argument itself. Everything you need to know is on the screen. But how do you analyze? The kinds of skills you're going to apply, that is something that you need to bring to the test. And that's, of course, something you need to learn and get ready for and practice. If you have any questions, please let me know. Put them in the chat box. Happy to talk about this question a little bit more if you would like. But if you don't have any questions, I have another question for you. It's going to be another critical reasoning question. So now that we talked a little bit about the different parts of the argument, and now we know that there's not just the conclusion and the evidence, but there's also something that's called an assumption. Now, something that we need to believe in order for us to link the evidence and the conclusion and make the conclusion more likely to be true. Well, sometimes we actually need to find what that assumption was. Here we did. We found that assumption, and that was there was that earthquake, not some other one, and then we're looking for some new facts that makes that assumption likely to be true. In the next question, you are actually going to be asked to identify that assumption. What actually the author must have believed in order for them to draw that claim. So let me give you about 2 minutes or so to try to figure out what is the answer to this question. Have another minute. Okay, I'll give you another 15 seconds to choose an answer, and we can talk about this question. Okay, let me end the poll and share the results with you. Just for full disclosure, we have about half of the people only who voted on this question. So of that half of the people who voted, about half chose answer choice E. So that's basically a quarter of everybody here. So E seems to be the most popular answer, followed by D, and then B as a distant third. Well, let's actually have a look. There's quite a few information here. They talk about the species, broad ranges, the broad range, the likeliness to survive extinction. So let's try to make sense of that information that is given to us. And for this, we might use a bit of formal logic rules. Let's try to formalize what is actually happening here. What does this biologist say? They say that species with broad geographic ranges probably tend to endure longer. So essentially, if they have a broad range, then they endure longer. We also know that the broader species range, the more likely that species survive extinction. So if they have a broad range, they're going to survive extinction, or more likely going to survive extinction. Therefore, okay, so now we get into a conclusion. So far, we've seen some evidence. Let's get to a conclusion. Therefore, it is likely that the proportion of species with broad ranges tend to gradually increase. So what are they actually saying in the conclusion? If they have broad ranges, then they are going to gradually increase, or likely going to gradually increase. Okay, so what do we have here in this little map of this passage? In the evidence, we had, if they have a broad range, they endure longer and survive extinction. In the conclusion, they claim if they have a broad range, they will gradually increase. Where does this gradually increase come from? The evidence was about enduring longer and surviving extinction. Does that mean that they're going to gradually increase? Is that the same thing? So, see, very often what we're going to do is we are going to connect the dots in our own mind. Because, I mean, that's what we do, right? So we make a lot of assumptions. We're saying, okay, so if I know this and I know this, I need to connect the dots. I need to make some logical conclusions and deductions and things like that. But very rarely in our everyday life, we need to step back and ask ourselves a question. What is that other people assume without bringing in our own opinions or our own assumptions? So doing something like this in a question like this would be very helpful, because it shows you how they are all of a sudden talk about something else that they didn't talk about before. So what that means is that our assumption needs to connect these concepts. And the question was asking us about the assumption to identify what was actually assumed by these biologists. So they must have been assuming that enduring longer and surviving extinction, one or the other, will somehow lead them to gradually increase. And that's why the answer to this question is actually D, because D exactly connects these concepts from the evidence and the conclusion. If they endure longer, they will gradually increase. If you have any questions about this question, please let me know in the chat box. I want to do another fun question. It's going to be a little bit easier. So here's a fun little question. It's actually about the GMAT and studying for the GMAT. So let me rewind your poll, and I'm going to give you about a minute and a half to try to figure out what is the answer to this question. Give you another 15 seconds to choose an answer. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me go ahead and end the poll and share the results with you. So most of you correctly identified that the correct answer is indeed D. So what is happening here? We have some evidence and we have a conclusion. The evidence is about the average reported GMAT score. The conclusion is about you achieving that result, right? So what they are saying basically is that if the average reported score is this, then everybody who comes in will be able to achieve that result, or the chance of getting that would be high. So again, we don't want to question the evidence. The average reported score may actually indeed be 730. But if we're saying that this average reported score isn't representative of what kinds of results people actually see, then that is going to break apart the evidence and will make the conclusion less likely to be true. So sample not representative, right? So when you see, this is a fun little question that we poke fun at one of our competitors, because that's actually true. That they do inflate their score results, and the truth is that only a very small percentage of people report the scores. But that is beside the point. You might see something similar on the test, and when the test is giving you results of some sort of a survey or some sort of analysis or an average, and they're drawing a conclusion based on this, you got to be thinking really critically and not necessarily question that survey, but question the relevance of that survey. Okay, so let's talk about the next question type. We talked about critical reason. We did a few questions, and I know you are really, really excited to hear about reading comprehension, right? Yeah, I could feel. I can't see you, unfortunately. In our real classes, our 6-week programs, the live classes, I can actually see you, especially if you're in person. But if you're online, I can see you on the webcam. But I can feel like how excited you are about reading comprehension. Yeah. So what makes reading comprehension hard? What do you think? Let me know in the chat box. Why is reading comprehension not well loved? Maybe it doesn't deserve to be not well loved. I actually really enjoy reading comprehension, and I'll share with you in just a moment why. Okay, short time, vocabulary, yeah, a lot of the tricky, yeah. I mean, honestly, a lot of the questions on the GMAT, pretty much everything on the GMAT is tricky, but the reading comprehension passages were not written specifically for the GMAT. They were written by some scientists who did some sort of research, and then they got adapted and published for the GMAT. So imagine you've been in a test, and maybe the verbal section is your last section. You've been in a test, and all of a sudden you read a passage about mating habits of snails after 2 hours of the test. So exciting, right? So they could, or maybe they could give you a passage on astrophysics or molecular biology. Could be about something really complex that's hard to understand. The passage structure sometimes could be complex as well. These passages are not written for popular culture. It's not something you can find in, the Sun. This is or the Sun newspaper. This is something that you're really going to find in some specialized journals. We have very limited time to try to pull out as much information as we need. We often don't have enough time to really understand everything in the passage, and we don't need to. There's usually lots to read. The passages are quite long. Another challenge about reading comprehension is that you're going to see several questions. Always, for each passage, there'll be 3 to 4 questions. But you don't know what questions are coming. So when you're reading the question for the first time, you don't know what they would ask. Now the question is, or the passage is going to stay there, it's not going to disappear, but it's not like we have the time to go back to it so many times. So we need to pull just enough information, but not get buried into too many details. So all of these are really valid reasons why maybe reading comprehension isn't as enjoyable, but there's something that you don't really need to worry about, and that is unfamiliar topics. Unfamiliar topics is not a problem and should not be a problem. In fact, the less you know about that topic, the better. If I'm reading a passage on molecular biology and know absolutely nothing about it, I'm not going to be bringing in my own knowledge, my own assumptions. That might not be the helpful assumptions, might be against what the passage was telling me. So it's very easy to actually fall into that trap of bringing in outside knowledge. So that's why the topic isn't important. So you might be wondering then, what's important? What's important is not what the author is saying, but how they're saying it. In fact, our objective is not to educate ourselves on that topic. Our objective is to answer the questions. And the questions are not going to require knowledge of that subject matter. The questions are going to require that we understand the overall narrative of the passage. Essentially, how is the passage structured? As long as we are able to pull out that structure and, if necessary, go back to a specific place in the passage and find the detail that the question might be about, you can master the skill of reading comprehension, and it could become one of your strong points on the GMAT. I can tell you, I've been teaching the GMAT for 15 years now, and occasionally, if I'm not careful, sometimes I'm lazy, I'm going to make a mistake in a quant question, like a simple computational error. I know it's embarrassing, but, it happens sometimes. But in reading comprehension, it's been many years since I've made any mistake in any question. Just because once you master this skill, and I've been doing this for many years, and, you don't need to necessarily spend so many years as I did. Some people are saying, well, the GMAT so well, you must be really smart. I said, well, it took me so many years to actually be where I am right now, teaching these skills to other people. So once you master this skill, there's really nothing the GMAT can do to trick you, as long as you learn these skills. So how do you do that? Where do you start? Well, it all starts by knowing how to read a passage. So essentially, we need to start rewiring our brain to read the passages differently. We usually read the passages because we want to learn something. If I give you a magazine with an article and say, come back to me in 5 minutes and tell me as much as you know about this article. Usually what a lot of people are going to do is they're going to try to pull out some of the content of the passage. Rarely somebody's going to come in and you say, you know what? The author began by presenting a theory that's in contrast with some old theory, and then brought scientist X who actually trying to refute that theory and things like that, right? So rarely would people do that. But that's what you actually need to start doing when you're reading the passages. So what I would like to encourage you to do is the next time you read some sort of a specialized magazine, maybe like a reading comprehension passage, or even if you're reading something like The Economist or New York Times, you can actually pick a fairly short article and try to see how is it organized. And when you're doing this, you want to focus on understanding the purpose of whatever is being said. You can start by understanding and summarizing the purpose of a paragraph, but then afterwards you can start breaking it down even further. If the author is doing a few things in a paragraph, then try to understand where they're starting to do something else. Maybe in the first half of the paragraph they talked about one theory, but then they're switching and talking about some other theory. And ask yourself a question, why would they do that? The actual minute details are not that important, but why have they done that? That's important. Maybe you can even try to predict what they're going to do next. Right? And that's the exercise that we do in our 6-week program is we actually go through the different keywords and the different ways to break down the passages. We look at the variety of different passages. And also what we do is as we go through the passages, we're trying to anticipate where the author might go next. And that's really helpful because it builds up that anticipation, that skill of being proactive. And that's what helps you be a lot more efficient on the test. So as you read the passage, you might even want to take some notes. Right now, as you're reading passages from maybe some of your favorite magazines, you don't have to do that. But you can also practice and just saying the author did this for the following purpose. Once you have done that, once you finish reading the passage, and ideally you want to read the passage only once and make some notes about this passage, about the overall structure of the passage, then you want to answer a few more questions. What I would suggest that you actually write a title to this passage. Reading comprehension passages on the GMAT do not have titles. You just launch into the text. You don't even know what to expect. So when you finish reading the passage, write a title. That is going to be really helpful because it'll help you understand what was mentioned in the passage and perhaps what wasn't mentioned. And also sometimes the GMAT will simply flat out ask you, what would be an appropriate title for this passage? Well, if you answer that question, not only are you helping yourself with other questions, but you can get some easy points for this kind of a question because you already have an answer. You also want to notice what was the author's tone or emotion. Was the author neutral? Were they positive or critical? Or were they trying to convince us of something? Were they overly biased? Were they argumentative? And then finally, you want to ask yourself a question, why did the author write this? What was the primary purpose of this entire passage? Was it again to argue? Was it to evaluate something? Was it just simply to inform us? And again, this is going to be very helpful because quite often the GMAT is going to ask us, what was the author doing? What was the main concern or the main purpose? But for many of the other questions, this is also going to be very helpful. There's a very common type of questions on the GMAT that is called an inference question, where we're being asked what is supported by the passage or what would the author of a passage agree with. Well, if we understand what the author was trying to do, what was the author's goal, it's going to be a lot easier for us to answer these questions. Sounds good? Make sense? Sounds easy, right? Yeah. I know. I love this, but and you know what? This this easy button from Staples, I've had it for over 10 years, and it actually means a lot to me right now because the CEO of Staples Canada was actually my client. And now this person, her name is Rachel, she was in my class when I had this button, and at that time she worked for Shoppers Drug Mart. But now she's actually a CEO of Staples Inc., which is a company in the US that has like thousands of stores all across the US. So every time I press the button, I remember Rachel, how she was in my class, and everybody was wondering, she's a VP, why does she do the GMAT trying to get into a business school? And she's like, look, guys, there's always the next level. And 10 years later, she's the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. But of course, it takes these steps, right? Each step could be made easy. If you break things down to smaller chunks, smaller steps, the GMAT could be enjoyable. But it's important to really do that, to break things down into these chunks. So let's talk about how do we do that. Let's talk about the resources, and I'll give you a plan. And also, I will share with you some of the resources that you could actually use, you could take advantage of right now. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to be brutally honest with you. This is not an easy test. So when you see somebody saying that the average score is 730, well, take it with a bit of a grain of salt. I don't want to give you false promises. This is impossible that everybody gets a score of 730. If it did, then the average score at the business schools would be much higher, because the business schools only, like top business schools, usually take only top 5 to 10% of candidates, sometimes even higher. So it is a hard test, but here's good news. This is your opportunity to shine. This is your opportunity to take the stand for your own future and say, I will take no prisoners. I will really master this test. And with the right structure, with the right strategy, with the right support, you can do that. Anybody can get any score, as long as it's 805 or below. It takes a little bit longer to get a higher score, but anybody can get a score of somewhere in top 10% in just a few months. You just need to be very focused and learn the strategies that work, and maybe ask for help if you need that help. Now, not everybody does that. And that's why when you're thinking about your competition for business schools, I want to give you some really interesting statistics that hopefully is going to maybe be a little bit motivating, but also maybe, it opened my eyes when I saw that for the first time. And is according to the GMAT, there are about 13 million people that every year would be exploring the business schools. They have a way to calculate this somehow. I don't exactly know how, but that's what they have. About 13 million, and ranges from like 12 to 15 million people who are thinking, maybe I'm going to go to a business school. They do some research, maybe they go to different events or read articles, whatever. So of these people, about 2 million people will actually get more serious about doing the GMAT, and they will create an account on MBA.com. They'll buy a book, they download a practice test, they will do a few questions, like mini quizzes. It's about 2 million people. Of these 2 million people, guess how many will actually do the real test? Only about 100,000 people a year. So 5% of everybody who's saying, yeah, I'm going to study for the test, will actually do the test. What about 95% of the people? Well, they give up. Maybe it wasn't that important, maybe it was too hard. And then of the 100,000 people that actually take the test, how many people get the score in top 10%? Well, obviously 10% of people, right? That's 10,000 people. So when we're thinking about the top 10 percentile scores, which is on the current scale of the GMAT, 645 and above, this is generally the score that you would want to top global schools. For some of the top US schools, you might want to score a little bit higher, usually in top 3 to 5%. So if you're looking at Stanford, Harvard, Columbia, some of the schools that are maybe known as M7 or S15, you might want a little bit of a higher score. Most Canadian schools, you generally want to score in the range of 605 and above. So that tends to be the top 20% or so. most global schools, European schools, Asian schools, you generally want to be in the top 10%, so 645 and above. So if we're thinking about, well, how many people get that score? And we say, well, it's 10%. But the reality is we are not counting everybody who maybe thought of doing this but didn't do it. So if you and I wake up in the morning and say, well, let me do some research. I just heard that MBA is a good idea. Maybe I should explore it. Of those people, less than 1 in 1,000 will actually get a score good enough to get into the top business schools. But a lot will depend on us. The odds are not in our favor, but it's not a lottery. And that's why this is, again, our opportunity to take a stand and say, I will get what I need. And that's why we work with a lot of people who get into global top schools. I have many of our clients who graduate from, Rotmans, the Ivies, the Harvards, the Stanfords, the Cambridge, the Oxford, and the INSEAD, and many, many others. I've been just very privileged. I've been doing this for 15 years, so literally has thousands of people who've taken our classes. And I can tell you that what is common among these people is that they're really committed and dedicated. They all come from different backgrounds. Some of them have math background, some of them don't. Some of them speak English as the first language, and that's the only language they speak. Some of them speak 5 languages. Some of them had a very rewarding career so far, and some of them are trying to, switch their career because maybe their career is not going so well. But what a lot of people have in common, of people who go to top business schools, they really put a lot of emphasis to trying to present the best possible application, because this is their chance to enter this club of getting into these business schools. And once you're in, you're going to find a way to pay for it. There's some scholarships, fundings available. The hardest thing about this whole process is to get in. Once you get in, if you have the right skills and you've prepared for the GMAT, you got a score, you will succeed in the MBA program. That's one of the also reasons why top business schools that have very competitive programs and very rigorous process, they would want to see not just your GPA that might have been in a different discipline, but also the GMAT. Because if you got a high score, that means you're ready for the business school. We would often have people like Rachel, I mentioned, who was a CEO of Staples. She came to us. One of the reasons she was applying to an executive MBA program, one of the reasons why she was taking our classes is, she told me, is she wants to get back to school. She wants to feel like what it's like being in class again, kind of get mentally ready for the program. And as a result, she actually did a dual degree with MBA, Master of Finance, and she's been at the top of her class. Right? So this is also your chance to get ready. Some people that I speak with, they say, can I get into some MBA program that doesn't require the GMAT? Well, but what are we going to do once we get there? Everything we're going to do in the MBA is going to be so much harder than the GMAT. I remember I got the top 1%, but when I got into the MBA program, I was overwhelmed. It was just a lot. I did really well and I graduated on top of my class, but it's quite a lot of work. So you need to be ready for it. And if you're ready, then you're going to get the results that you want. That's how the game of the GMAT is played. A simple idea. If you want results in the top 10%, you just simply need to do things differently from the other 90% of people. That's it. So, if you go on Reddit and you see people that are not getting the results that they want, or you have a bunch of friends who are trying to study for the test and are not seeing these results, ask them, what have they done? And don't do it. I have a lot of people who come to us for private tutoring. I've been studying, I've been doing this and I've been doing that. I was talking to a couple of people yesterday who were saying they've been, studying for a while and not really seeing the results. So maybe you just need to do things differently. Don't do that. Sometimes you need to ask yourself, what have I been doing that doesn't get me the result that I want? So how do we actually start changing the way that we approach the questions or the way that we approach preparation for the GMAT? Well, we said that this is a skills-based test. it's a test that evaluates not what you know, but what you can do, how you approach these problems, the different strategies. So I've already compared this with learning a new sport. But you can also compare this with learning, for example, how to drive a car, because driving a car is also a skill. When you began learning driving a car, for the very first time, you weren't skilled. That's why it was so overwhelming. But now you just get in a car and you just drive because you're skilled. So how did we actually master that? Well, let me share with you the steps you can take. And with each of these steps, I'm also going to share with you some of the resources that you could use. So feel free to grab pen and paper and make some notes. Step number one, before you begin studying or learning the strategies, for example, if you were to join our class, the first step we're going to do is we're going to give you a review of foundations, essentially a module that will help you review some of the basics that you have learned in high school. Some of the math foundations like, what's a fraction, what's a prime number, how do you prime factorize a number, what's the least common multiple, what's the greatest common factor, what's an absolute value, and things like that. Learning these first before you tackle more difficult questions is going to save you a lot of time down the road. There's some foundations for verbal as well, like, what's a fact, what's an opinion, different structures of the arguments, different components, building up your skill. One of the things you can do, for example, is anytime you hear an argument, you can try to break it down. What's the conclusion? What's the evidence? What are some of the assumptions people are making? Right? So you're building these foundational skills. That's what we did when we learned how to drive a car. The first thing, we built a foundational skill. Right? Green means go and red means stop. Right? If I don't know that, how can I be on the road? And that's why many of us took this written test as the first level. But that wasn't enough for us to drive a car. Right? And you could think of this kind of written test. The GMAT doesn't really have that, test of the foundations, but you could kind of think of this a little bit as a combination of, number one, doing a bunch of exercises that will allow you to apply this theory. So for example, you might say, I know how to prime factorize a number. I know how to find the least common multiple, greatest common factor. Well, great, do it. Do a bunch of exercises. There are lots of resources available. If you take our class, we actually give you access to a premium resource that will give you in an adaptive fashion, will give you a lot of questions, and you're going to need to answer the questions quickly. It's kind of like a little game where every time you answer the question correctly, your score goes up, and if incorrectly, you're going to see an explanation, the score goes down, and you need to achieve a certain score. Right? So in a kind of fun little gamification way, you're building these foundations, which are going to be very important when you start tackling harder GMAT questions or trickier GMAT questions. Okay. But another thing that you can do here at this step is, as you had a little bit of a review of the foundations, you can actually go ahead and take a practice test. Because the GMAT also is able to determine where you stand in terms of the overall difficulty of the questions. Some of the easier questions are a bit more straightforward. So for them, that foundation might be all you need. Some of the harder questions, though, will require some more logical thinking, some applying some of the out-of-the-box ways of doing the questions. So if you are taking a practice test and you score somewhere below 450, or maybe like 500, you definitely need a very solid review of the foundations, and you need to practice these foundations. And if you're scoring above 500, then usually that means that your foundations are relatively strong, so you might need to close some gaps, but you need to focus more on the strategies. So that's why if you sign up for our class, we're going to give you access to these foundational resources, a review, and then we're going to ask you to take a practice test. Again, because we want to make sure that you're studying very efficiently. So we're going to guide you through this whole process. Here's some of the resources that I might suggest in order to help you build these foundations. First of all, the GMAT official guide has an excellent review of the foundations. Chapters 3, 5, and 7 in the current version of the official guide will be giving you a review of what are the things that you need to know for each of these 3 sections. You actually don't need a lot of outside resources if you can go through the official guide and understand what is written there. It is not very well written. Let me just be honest with you. It does cover everything you need to know, but it doesn't do that in a way that's easy to learn. So there are some additional resources that you might potentially take. A great resource for math is the book called Arithmetic and Algebra Again by Britta Immergut. And I can send you a link to these resources on Amazon if you would like. This book goes through the basic math foundations in a fairly digestible way. It does a better job than the official guide to actually explain why things work a certain way. It doesn't just say, here's what you do. It just says, why do you actually do that? It goes a little bit deeper. Another great book for building your foundations is Shortcut Math by Gerard Kelly. This is the book that teaches you mental math. On the GMAT quantitative reasoning section, you are not given a calculator. So you do need to be comfortable with mental math. And this book is an excellent resource for that. Now, with the 11th edition of the GMAT, we also often recommend our clients to brush up a little bit on their formal logic skills. During our 6-week program, we actually do take the time to teach you the foundations of formal logic because it now becomes increasingly important. There are many questions right now that rely on the logic. So logic becomes more important on the GMAT, and that's why we recommend learning a bit of logic. Now, if you are a bit of an overachiever and you want to learn a lot, then there's an excellent course called Introduction to Logic by Michael Genesares, and you can find it on Stanford Online. It is a free course, but it takes some time to go through it. So it takes a few weeks to go through this course. But you will learn a lot about logic. It is definitely going to be helpful. But if you take our class, then this is something we're going to teach you in a classroom setting, and we'll teach you just what you need to know, because there's a lot that you can potentially learn about logic. And it's all helpful for general education, but there's a subset of what you need for the GMAT. But having the understanding of the formal logic, some of the things that I've shown you, like, this leads to that, and, how do you connect the different dots? How do you flip them? And how do you actually work with these? How do you change some of the logical statements? That is going to be quite important. Now, what is important, ladies and gentlemen, at this step is do be sure to practice the skills that you learn. Don't just read about them. Because if you, for example, read some really cool strategies from the Shortcut Math book, but you don't apply them, and you still go back to your calculator, then on the day of the test, it's going to be quite challenging. And even when you start studying for the GMAT, actually start learning the strategies, it is going to be quite challenging for you to go through these strategies. So let's talk about the next step, is then master the strategies. When we learned how to drive a car, this was actually being in the car for the first time. I remember the first time I was in a car and I learned how to drive a stick shift. That was terrible. I was like, where do I even start? There's like 3 pedals, there's a stick shift, there are a bunch of controls here, there's this, steering wheel and some mirrors, and like, oh my gosh, I will never be able to drive, right? And that's why a lot of people give up. There's just so many things that you don't know kind of what's gonna hit you, right? But taking things one step at a time, and that's what we did. Hopefully, if you had a good instructor, what this instructor did is he or she showed you some of the best practices, because they experienced, they've been doing this for a while, and they taught many other people. So they show you what works, what doesn't work. They tell you in what situation you could do what. So how do you react in different situations? So on the GMAT, it's like, if I see this kind of a question, is this question about ratios? Is that an algebra question? What is the strategy that I can use, given that I only have 2 minutes? I need to react quickly to get to the answer, and I have 5 options. And then what's important is not just to listen to other people doing this, because again, we can go on YouTube, we can watch a bunch of really smart people doing cool GMAT questions, but then when we try to apply them ourselves, it becomes a lot harder. Sometimes, again, we intellectually understand, but we haven't practiced enough and we haven't merged them with our own skills. So that's why what works great for many people, and that's what worked for us when we were in the car with the instructor, is for us to try things out and recognize that we are going to be making mistakes, at least initially. And if we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, we're not learning. Like if you go on Reddit, you would notice there's some people, sometimes I almost want to cry when I see somebody studying for the GMAT for like 5 years, 7 years. I'm like, oh my gosh, get a life. So you want to make sure that you're always progressing, you're always improving, and there's a way to do this. And one of the great ways to do this is to learn these best strategies up front, and then at least on the initial stages of your learning, get a lot of feedback. Like as you're trying things for the first time, get a lot of feedback. A lot of people would say, should I come to a GMAT class after having studied for like a year? Well, I don't know. After having been driving a car for a year, would I want to go back to the class? Probably not. If the person's already a really bad driver, nothing might help them. It might be really difficult. But learning this upfront is usually more efficient. And again, there are different ways to do this. But if you are just at the beginning of your preparation, what we usually suggest is, learn these strategies first and then practice them. Because what you're also going to learn is a bit more about yourself, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what works and doesn't work. But you're also going to learn the process of self-improvement. Initially, there's an instructor. Like you're there for 6 weeks, the instructor is saying, okay, here's what you can do differently. I noticed, and that's why some people are asking, what's the difference between watching a class, let's say in recording, or being in a live class? Well, in the recording, you're watching the instructor, but the instructor doesn't watch you. And that's a big difference. Now, also in the recorded class, you can't ask a question in real time. You can still ask the question. For example, if you take our GMAT Mastery program, you can still reach out to the instructor, but the instructor only knows what you're doing if they speak with you, but they don't see you in a class. So they cannot give you that proactive feedback just because they don't really know what you're doing at home. They can see the report of what you're doing, but still, they need to get a little bit into your head and see your process of reasoning. And that's what's happening in a class, kind of a bit of magic. Okay? So how do you actually learn these strategies? Well, there are a few ways. One way is our GMAT Mastery program. This is an all-inclusive 6-week coaching course. You can take it live or on demand. Live, if you have the time to come to the class, again, usually helps you a little bit more because you have that immediate feedback and you can ask questions immediately. So this GMAT Mastery program, we call it an all-inclusive program because it includes all the books, all the materials, mock exams, everything that you need. It includes coaching, and you're in class for 6 weeks, intensive learning, twice a week, 3.5 hours. But in addition to that, there is support. So you can always reach out. We are on WhatsApp. You're part of a study group. Anytime within a year, you can come back to a class. I'll give you a little bit more detail about that. There's also a self-study option. So GMAT Mastery, you can think of this as kind of like a group coaching class. It's cost-effective, and yet you get a lot out of this process. The GMAT Express is what we call GMAT Express. It's essentially a subscription-based self-study program. There's some other self-study programs out there as well, I know. So ours focuses a lot on the strategies, and it also helps you stay very focused because the program is broken down into modules. So we designed this program for quick impact in some specific areas, right? So if you need a little bit of an improvement and you want to learn some strategies specifically for a couple of areas, you don't really care about feedback, then this is a fairly cost-effective and it works on subscription. You go on our website and you can actually save 30% with the discount code that I'm going to give you in just a few minutes. And another way to learn the strategies is through private tutoring. Private tutoring is one-on-one, very highly personal coaching. It focuses 100% of your progress. This tends to usually involve a little bit of a bigger investment of funds and resources, but it's even more efficient because you're just working directly with the instructor one-on-one, and we're tweaking things as we go. So super efficient, hyper-focused exactly on you. So this was step 2. Learn the foundations. Step 2, learn the strategies. What about step 3? Is there a step 3? Yes, there is. There is actually step 3. And step 3 is practice. Now, we talked about this a little bit already, but in many of the provinces and states, for example, in the province of Ontario, where I am, there is a graduated licensing program for driving a car. That means that if you want to be fully licensed, you need to not just pass your first driving test, but also drive for about a year and then pass your next test. Because practice is important, right? But does practice really make perfect? Well, only if we're practicing things that work. Only if we're practicing the good strategies, if we're developing the good habits. I like another phrase. Practice makes a habit. The more we practice something, the more we are going to get good at doing that. So if we're practicing something that doesn't work, like for example, imagine this, you're doing a quant question, you're always trying to solve it using algebra. And that's what we keep doing over and over and over again, which just gets so ingrained in our mind that it's hard for us to see that there's another way. So sometimes it's a bit hard to unlearn. So practice is going to be really, really important. If you come to our class, we are going to give you a ton of practice resources, literally thousands of questions. So where do you practice? Let's talk about some of these possible sources. First of all, the GMAT official guide. This is actually the only source of real questions from past exams, aside from the MBA.com website, where you can find them as well. But in terms of the printed material, this is the only book. So if you buy a book by Kaplan or Princeton Review or any other book that you can find in a bookstore, or GMAT for Dummies, or Barron's or anything else, 100% of the questions in those books are not real questions. But there's a big difference between using real questions and using simulated questions. Just to give you an idea, when a test preparation company wants to develop questions for themselves to publish in a book, they usually pay approximately $15 for each question to special people who write the questions. So there's GMAT instructors or some other people in different parts of the world who say, I'm just going to make a little bit of money writing these questions, and they pay them about $15. The GMAT, though, spends about $2,000 writing every single question. So you can understand the quality of the questions is going to be very, very different. And these questions get tested multiple times. The more than 10 people look at these questions, they go through multiple rounds of testing. So when you're buying a book with 1,000 questions, you're getting about $2 million worth of questions. So the GMAT spent about $2 million writing these questions. These are the best possible questions. So you definitely need to have the GMAT official guide. And if you come to our class, the homework is going to be from the official guide, and the questions we use in class, almost all of them will also be from the official sources. They're going to be real questions from past exams, because there's really no match to questions from past exams. You cannot buy our book in a bookstore. Right? If we did do that, we're going to have to hire somebody for $15 to write these books. But in the class, we use a lot of the official resources. And that's why you are really learning from the best possible source. There's also the official GMAT question bank, which is giving you access to the questions from the official guide, as well as some additional questions in the online quiz bank forum, where you can actually do some mini quizzes, and especially some of the quizzes that involve some interaction. Like there are questions in the data insight section that ask you to, for example, sort a table. Well, for that, you're going to need the official question bank. And if you buy the official guide, then your book comes with a 12-month subscription to that quiz bank. And if you come to our class, we actually do give you an official guide, the latest version, and you will also have access, as part of the course, a 12 months access to the GMAT official guide online. There's some supplemental official guides as well. You can purchase, if you would like, the additional Quant Verbal and Data Insights official guides. They each come with their own online access, and there are about 200 to 300 questions, additional questions from these supplemental official guides. So also something good to practice if you feel like you need more questions. The main official guide has about 1,000 questions, so if you feel that you need more, then supplemental official guides are also a great source. Official GMAT practice tests. These are really the tests that you need to be taking as you are getting close to the real test. That's why we usually suggest take at least one official test as your diagnostic, and then as you're getting comfortable with the strategies, you're going to be taking the official test. So as part of our course, we're going to be suggesting that you, and I'll show you what are some of the other things that you might be doing, but as you're getting closer to your real test, you need to be taking the official mocks from MBA.com. There are 2 tests available for free, and you can purchase 4 more tests for $108 for all 4. Each of the tests is designed to be taken twice without seeing repeated questions, and this many people don't know that. But essentially, you have access to a grand total of 12 tests, because you can get 2 plus 4 you can buy, that's 6, but each is designed to be taken twice. It's actually by design. You can take them more than twice, but then you will see repeated questions. But if you take them twice, you will not. Now, in addition to that, there are many other resources available. As part of our course, or if you subscribe to our GMAT Express self-study program for 6 months or more, 6 or 12 months, you're also going to get access to our adaptive learning platform, which gives you access to about 5,000 simulated questions. And yes, there will be questions that are simulated, but what's great about this platform is it helps you practice your time management. And there are a lot of very useful features, like the timers and the pacers and the very comprehensive and sophisticated reports where you can actually see what exactly you need to work on. So this is also something that we use as a supplement to your learning, and it comes with your program. Once you completed the majority of the questions from the official guide, you're going to be doing a lot of time practice on this platform. That's very user-friendly, and it really helps you stay very, very focused on what you need to improve. There's some mock exams there as well that are helpful for your initial mock exams after the end of the course, where you are still, again, getting used to the timing on the test, and then you switch into MBA.com, and then we continue supporting you all the way till the day of the test. And even as part of your course, we give you some guidance on the resume and the overall application, and we have people who can help you with the entire application process. So if you would like to join our class, our next course is actually starting on so there we go. Yes, our next course is starting on January 10th. And that is going to be our weekend GMAT class. Our evening class starts on January 27th. And the classes are twice a week for 3.5 hours. If you book your seat now, you can save $200 on any course, any future course, any course that comes up. If you go to admitmaster.com/offer, you can actually see that offer. You can also try some other options. If you would like to try the self-study option, what we call the GMAT Express, you can also see some demos on that same website, admitmaster.com/offer. And in fact, if you would like to chat a little bit more and you like me to reach out to you and give you some demos and maybe talk a little bit more about your overall application, then definitely please also let me know, and we can go over this as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to wrap things up, this whole experience, this whole journey is really designed to help you get an edge when you are applying to business schools. You can get this edge by applying to better schools, by getting some scholarships. And I can tell you, for example, here's one of our clients who studied with us. We also coached him on the application, ended up with a scholarship of $42,000, and that was to one of the schools in Montreal. So you can definitely improve your return on investment if you are putting in the effort in mastering the test. Learning the skills will help you also get an edge on the GMAT. A lot of people, when they are preparing for the test, are focusing a lot more on the theory. And that's what a lot of people do, and that's why the average scores worldwide are in the range of mid 500s. But if you really start focusing on the skills, you can definitely get much better results. And about a third of our clients get scores in the top 10%, and the average score is in the top 20%. So if you'd like to join us in our live class, then you can go on admitmaster.com/offer, still save $200 on the next course. It's not available on the general website, but if you go to that specific page, then you should be able to claim that discount. If you decide to register for our live class, then all we need is a $500 deposit, and it will give you access to the foundational materials. You also secure your early bird discount. Our next Master Refresher class is going to be on Wednesday, January 7th. If you would like to take a practice test, you can go on trygmat.com. And if you're interested in some of the other study options, like maybe more of self-study options, again, you can go on admitmaster.com/offer. All of our classes are upgradable to the higher tier. So for example, if you, let's say you sign up and try the self-study option, you can try it for free for 7 days. And afterwards, let's say you decide to get a subscription for 6 months. And while your subscription is still active, you say, you know what, I would actually prefer to come to a live class. Well, as long as your subscription is still active, you can upgrade to the live class or to the GMAT Mastery on Demand program, where you're actually going to have an opportunity to work with an instructor by watch recordings, and you will just be responsible for the difference in the fees. We are very fortunate, we're very flexible, we have different options that you can take advantage of. So you can find all of that, ladies and gentlemen, at admitmaster.com/offer. I know many of you mentioned that you would like to chat one-on-one. So what's going to happen is I will actually reach out to you tomorrow by email or by WhatsApp, and we're going to set up some time for us to chat. If you haven't indicated that you want to talk, but you want to do it later on, then you can just respond back to my email. You can also go always on our website and click on the button free consultation, upload your resume if you would like to get some advice on the application overall and not just on the GMAT, and we can continue this discussion. I'm here to help. I am your resource. As you can see, I'm very passionate about what I do. I love the work that I do, and I just whenever I see our clients succeed and go to different places, like I could really be here until probably the next Christmas, talking about the different stories of how people completely changed their lives, and maybe didn't have a good job, or maybe lost their job, and now all of a sudden they started their own business, or they work for the United Nations, or the managers at McKinsey. So certainly, if you connect one-on-one, and if you tell me a little bit about your background, I could share some of the ideas and some of the stories of other people who might have been in your shoes maybe a few years ago, and what have they done, and what are some of the outcomes that they have been able to see. So happy to have this discussion again, and I hope that we're going to speak soon. In case we don't speak before holidays, then Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate, any of the holidays, Kwanzaa, New Year, or maybe even nothing. If you have the time to really assess what's really great for you, and maybe start putting together a plan of how you're going to get there. We've been here for 2 hours, so you've invested this 2 hours of your time, and I certainly hope that this was helpful and this was valuable, and you've taken some notes and you have a little bit of a more clarity about how you can achieve your goals. But I'm here to help. If there's something that you still want to run by, or if you would like some advice on your personal situation or on your study plan, just send me an email and I'll be happy to help. And if you decide to come to our class, I look forward to seeing you live. And we're going to have a chance to interact a lot more and work together to help you get to the goals that you would like to accomplish. So thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a pleasure spending this time with you. And thanks for your kind words. Take care and all the best.